Philip and Elizabeth, 73 years of secrets, sacrifice, and sealant love. She was a princess who would become the most famous queen in history. He was a prince without a country, without money, and without a clear future. When they met, she was just 13 years old. He was 18, dashing in his naval cadet uniform, and from that moment, Elizabeth never looked at another man for the rest of her life. Now, you will hear the part of the story no one ever truly understood. The year was 1939. Europe stood on the brink of war. King George VI brought his family to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth for an official visit. His two daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, were kept separate from the cadets due to outbreaks of mumps and chickenpox at the college. A young cadet named Philip of Greece was assigned to entertain them. He was tall, blonde, athletic, and possessed an irreverent wit that made young Elizabeth laugh in ways palace life rarely permitted. Philip showed off for her, jumping over tennis nets, eating shrimp cocktail with theatrical enthusiasm, making jokes that bordered on inappropriate for royal company. Margaret, younger and perhaps more objective, found him show-offy. Elizabeth found him magnificent. By the time the royal yacht sailed away that evening, with Philip rowing alongside as far as he could, Elizabeth had made a decision that would shape the rest of the century. She would marry that young man, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. It was, by all accounts, love at first sight, or at least first meaningful sight. Elizabeth was 13, still a child in many ways, but possessed of a determination that would define her reign. Philip was 18, handsome but homeless in the deepest sense. His family had been exiled from Greece when he was an infant. His mother had suffered a severe mental breakdown and was institutionalized. His father had largely abandoned the family to live with a mistress in Monaco. Philip had been passed between relatives across Europe, never quite belonging anywhere. This rootlessness shaped Philip profoundly. He learned self-reliance because he had no choice. He developed a sharp tongue as a defense mechanism against those who looked down on his reduced circumstances, and he harbored a deep desire for purpose, for belonging, for a real home. Elizabeth, secure in her position, but lonely in her isolation, offered something he had never known: unconditional acceptance and unwavering devotion. But their path to marriage would be anything but simple. Imagine the obstacles facing their relationship in those early years. War had broken out across Europe. Philip served with distinction in the Royal Navy, seeing combat in the Mediterranean and the Pacific while Elizabeth waited in England, following his ship's movements on maps and writing letters that took weeks to arrive. The physical separation was painful, but perhaps more painful were the objections mounting against their union. The British establishment did not want Elizabeth to marry Philip. He was too foreign, Greek and Danish by blood, German by family connections at a time when Britain had just finished fighting Germany. He was too poor, a prince in name only, with no lands, no income, and no real standing. He was too brash. His jokes and informality unsettled courtiers, accustomed to rigid protocol, and there were whispered concerns about his family: a mentally ill mother, sisters who had married prominent Nazis, a father who had abandoned his responsibilities. King George VI liked Philip personally, but worried about the match. Queen Elizabeth, the future Queen Mother, actively opposed it. She found Philip lacking in polish and breeding too rough around the edges for her refined daughter. The palace establishment worked to introduce Elizabeth to more suitable candidates, British aristocrats with proper pedigrees and predictable temperaments. Elizabeth politely met them all and remained utterly uninterested. What happened next would reveal just how stubborn a young princess could be when she knew what she wanted. Elizabeth waited through 5 years of war, through through her father's objections, through the whisper campaigns against Philip, she simply refused to consider anyone else. When Philip formally proposed in 1946, she accepted immediately without consulting her parents, a breach of protocol that shocked the palace. King George, recognizing his daughter's determination, reluctantly agreed to the engagement, but insisted on delaying the announcement until after a royal tour to South Africa. The tour was partly designed to test Elizabeth's resolve. 4 months away from Philip, exposure to other potential suitors, time to reconsider. It failed completely. Elizabeth wrote to Philip constantly, counted the days until her return, and came back more certain than ever. The engagement was announced in July 1947. Britain, still exhausted from war and suffering through rationing and austerity, desperately needed something to celebrate. The romance of their future queen provided it. Philip's transformation for the wedding was significant. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles, converted from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglicanism, became a naturalized British citizen, and took the surname Mountbatten from his mother's family. He was created Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth, and Baron Greenwich. The penniless prince was now, on paper at least, a proper British royal, but the sacrifices required for this transformation would echo through their entire marriage. The wedding on November 20, 1947, was a moment of national joy amid post-war gloom. 2,000 guests filled Westminster Abbey. 200 million people listened on radio worldwide. Elizabeth's dress, designed by Norman Hartnell, required special permission because fabric was still rationed. Philip, in naval uniform, looked every inch the fairy tale prince. When they emerged as husband and wife, the cheering crowds stretched for miles. But the fairy tale contained compromises that would test them both for decades. Philip had given up everything: his name, his nationality, his religion, his naval career, to marry Elizabeth. In return, he expected to be the head of his household, the leader of his family, the decision-maker in his own home. What he discovered was that marrying the heir to the British throne meant surrendering that traditional masculine role entirely. Elizabeth would never take his name. Their children would not carry his surname. He would walk 2 steps behind his wife for the rest of his life. In the eyes of the institution, he was not her equal. He was her consort. This fundamental imbalance created tensions that surfaced repeatedly in their early marriage. Philip had been a successful naval commander, respected by his men, and rising rapidly through the ranks. He was accustomed to giving orders, to being in charge, to having his competence recognized. Now he was expected to stand beside his wife at ceremonial functions, smile, wave, and subordinate his own ambitions to her role. The adjustment was brutal. Elizabeth understood his frustration, but could do little to address it. The monarchy's traditions predated both of them by centuries. She could not remake the institution to accommodate her husband's ego, no matter how much she loved him. What she could do was create space within their private life for Philip to lead, to make decisions, to feel valued. Behind closed doors, by all accounts, Philip ran the household. He made decisions about the children's education, about family schedules, about domestic matters. Elizabeth deferred to him in private, even as he deferred to her in public. And what happened next would define their partnership for the next 7 decades. In February 1952, everything changed. King George VI died in his sleep, and Elizabeth, at just 25 years old, became queen. She was in Kenya when she received the news, up in a treehouse watching elephants at a watering hole. Philip was the one who told her, walking with her in the garden of Sagana Lodge, his arm around her shoulders as the weight of the crown descended. Those who witnessed the moment said Elizabeth was composed, focused, already shifting into the role she had been prepared for since childhood. Philip looked shattered. He knew what this meant. Whatever autonomy he had carved out in their marriage was now gone. His wife was no longer just a princess who would someday be queen. She was the queen, the head of state, the supreme governor of the Church of England, the living symbol of the nation. And he was her subject, required to bow to her in public, to walk behind her, to treat her with the deference owed to a monarch, even in their most intimate moments. The coronation in June 1953 made the hierarchy explicit. Elizabeth was crowned with ancient ceremonies that emphasized her divine appointment and supreme authority. Philip knelt before her, placed his hands between hers, and swore to be her liege man of life and limb. He then rose and kissed her cheek, the only person permitted such intimacy with the newly crowned sovereign. The gesture was touching, but the symbolism was clear. He served her, not the other way around. The early years of Elizabeth's reign tested their marriage severely. Philip chafed at the restrictions, at the courtiers who excluded him from decisions, at the sense that he was merely decorative. He threw himself into projects, modernizing palace administration, championing conservation, founding the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme for young people. But none of it compensated for the loss of his naval career. The identity he had built before marriage consumed everything. Rumors circulated about his behavior. Philip was often away from Elizabeth on overseas tours, sometimes for months at a time. His name was linked with various women, actresses, society ladies, friends' wives. The palace never commented on such rumors, and no concrete evidence of infidelity ever emerged. But the whispers persisted, fueled by Philip's reputation for enjoying female company and his extended absences from the Queen's side. But no one knew the real consequence of those rumors or what they revealed about the private understanding between Elizabeth and Philip. Those close to the couple described their relationship as one of deep mutual understanding that defied conventional expectations. Elizabeth loved Philip with an intensity she never directed at anyone else. Philip was devoted to Elizabeth in ways that his gruff exterior often masked. They argued, sometimes explosively, with Philip's temper matching his wife's stubborn silences. But they always reconciled. Whatever happened during Philip's long tours abroad, he always came home to Elizabeth, and she always welcomed him back without visible recrimination. The nature of their arrangement remained private. Elizabeth was not naive. She understood the rumors about her husband, but she also understood the sacrifices Philip had made for her, the identity he had surrendered, the frustrations he endured daily. If she chose to extend him certain freedoms in exchange for his public loyalty and support, that was between them. The marriage endured because both parties understood the terms, even if those terms were never publicly acknowledged. Their partnership strengthened as the decades passed. Philip became Elizabeth's most trusted advisor, the only person who could speak to her with complete honesty, who could tell her when she was wrong without fear of consequences. He handled the family's internal conflicts, negotiating with difficult relatives, managing the children's problems, serving as the family's enforcer when discipline was required. Elizabeth handled the public role. Philip handled the private chaos. The children complicated everything, as children do. Charles, the heir, was sensitive and introspective, completely different from his athletic, pragmatic father. Philip pushed Charles hard, too hard, according to many observers, trying to toughen him up for the demands of monarchy. The result was a strained relationship that never fully healed. Anne, competitive and sharp like her father, became his favorite. Andrew and Edward followed, creating a family that was by all accounts more functional than many royal households, if not exactly warm by ordinary standards. When Charles's marriage to Diana collapsed, Elizabeth and Philip handled the crisis as a team, though with different approaches. Philip wrote Diana letters, sometimes harsh in tone, trying to understand her perspective and urging her to reconcile with Charles. Diana interpreted these letters as hostile. Others saw them as a father-in-law's awkward attempt at connection. Elizabeth maintained more distance, constrained by her role as sovereign. Neither approach saved the marriage, but both reflected their respective styles. Philip direct and confrontational, Elizabeth reserved and institutional. Diana's death in 1997 created the greatest crisis of Elizabeth's reign. Philip's role during that terrible week was crucial. While Elizabeth focused on protecting William and Harry from media intrusion, Philip helped the boys process their grief. He walked behind Diana's coffin with them in the funeral procession. A 15-year-old and 12-year-old flanked by their grandfather, uncle, and father. It was Philip who convinced William to participate in the public procession when he initially refused. Through every crisis, Philip remained Elizabeth's anchor. He had no constitutional role, no official power, no authority beyond what Elizabeth chose to give him. Yet he shaped the monarchy profoundly, modernizing its operations, expanding its charitable work, providing the human warmth that Elizabeth's reserved personality sometimes lacked. He was rude to servants, impatient with stupidity, prone to gaffes that horrified the politically correct. He was also fiercely loyal, genuinely dedicated to public service, and utterly devoted to his wife. And what happened next would show the world what 73 years of partnership truly meant. As Philip aged, his health declined. He officially retired from public duties in 2017, at age 96, having completed more than 22,000 solo engagements and nearly 10,000 more alongside the Queen. The retirement was necessary. His body was failing, but it marked the beginning of the end of their partnership, as the world had known it. Elizabeth continued her duties, but something had shifted. Without Philip beside her at events, she seemed smaller, more solitary. The supporting presence that had anchored her for 7 decades was no longer there. She visited him regularly at Wood Farm, a cottage on the Sandringham estate, where he preferred to spend his retirement, away from palace formality. Their time together became private, precious, protected from public view. When Philip was hospitalized in February 2021, the nation held its breath. At 99, any health crisis could be his last. Elizabeth could not visit due to pandemic restrictions, a cruel irony for a couple who had been rarely separated in 73 years. Philip was transferred between hospitals, underwent a heart procedure, and finally returned home to Windsor Castle, but he was fading. On April 9, 2021, Prince Philip died peacefully at Windsor Castle, with Elizabeth by his side. He was 99 years old, just 2 months short of his 100th birthday. The Queen, in her formal announcement, said simply that his death left a huge void in her life. The understatement was characteristic. The grief behind it was immeasurable. The funeral, constrained by pandemic restrictions, was heartbreaking in its intimacy. Only 30 mourners attended, masked and socially distanced, in St. George's Chapel. Elizabeth sat alone, a tiny figure in black, separated from her family by the protocols designed to protect her health. The image captured something profound, the essential loneliness of sovereignty, the isolation of a woman who had shared her life with someone for 73 years, and now faced the remainder of her reign without him. Those who saw Elizabeth in the months after Philip's death described a woman diminished, not in her dedication to duty. She continued working, continued appearing at events, continued fulfilling her role as she had for nearly 70 years. But something essential was missing, the spark that Philip had provided, the human warmth behind the formal facade, the partner who had made the burden of the crown bearable, all gone. She followed him 17 months later, dying at Balmoral, On September 8th, she was 96 years old and had reigned for 70 years. In the end, she outlived Philip by less than 2 years, a brief moment after 7 decades together. Those who believe in such things said she was ready to join him, that her work was finally done, that the anchor that had kept her on earth was now calling her home. Their marriage defied easy categorization. Was it a love story? Certainly, in ways that mattered most. Was it a partnership of duty? Absolutely, with both parties sacrificing personal desires for institutional requirements. Was it perfect? No. They argued. They spent time apart. They disappointed each other. But they endured through wars, through crises, through scandals, through 73 years of relentless public scrutiny. Philip once said that he had given up everything to marry Elizabeth, and that the decision was worth every sacrifice. Elizabeth, more private about her emotions, showed her feelings through actions rather than words. She made Philip her companion at every significant moment, relied on his judgment, tolerated his flaws, and mourned him with the quiet devastation of someone who had lost not just a husband, but the foundation of her entire adult life. 73 years, secrets kept and rumors weathered, sacrifices made and resentments swallowed, silent love expressed through presence rather than words. In a century that saw divorce become commonplace and royal marriages become tabloid entertainment, Philip and Elizabeth remained together, flawed, complicated, occasionally difficult, but ultimately unbreakable. The world will remember Elizabeth as a queen, but she would want to be remembered perhaps as Philip's wife, the girl who saw a brash young naval cadet in 1939 and never looked at anyone else. That constancy, more than any crown or coronation, may be her truest legacy.